like starlight in the dark. Endless miles can't conceal you, and every glimmer is a spark, catching fire as you break through. Oh, you're not far away, you're coming close. And oh, even as I wait, you're coming close. You're like summer in the night. The sun goes down, but still I feel you. And every shadow's turning bright. Every broken heart is made new. Oh, you're not far away, you're coming close. And oh, even as I wait, you're coming close. There's no heart unseen, there's no space between you and I, you and I. You are closer than the very oxygen I'm breathing in. Oh, I breathe you in. You are God with us, you are here with us, Emmanuel, Emmanuel. You are infinite, your glory has no end. Jesus, Jesus. And oh, you're not far away, you're coming close. Ooh. And oh, even as I wait, you're coming close. I edited on that. Sorry, that didn't resolve nicely. Shoot.
Good morning, St. Philip's. Well, we are continuing in our series on the patriarchs, and this is the story of God redeeming his people through one man and his family. And last week we ended up with Isaac finding his wife, Rebekah. But what we didn't look at was chapter 25. Today we're looking at 26 and 27, so I'm going to give a brief summation of what happened there so you can follow along with the story. So Rebekah struggles with getting pregnant. And we've heard this before in the past. We've heard it with Sarah. And so after many years of Isaac praying, she finally becomes pregnant with twins. And the Lord tells her that the youngest one is the one that he's going to continue his promise through. He's going to fulfill the covenant through. And when she has them, she first has Esau, and then she has Jacob. And when Jacob comes out, he actually is grabbing his brother's heel. And that's what the name Jacob means, to seize the heel. And that phrase became known as someone who was a supplanter, somebody who took something wrongly from someone else. And then the end of that chapter, we see Esau selling his birthright to his brother Jacob for a pot of stew. Isaac becomes a hunter. He likes to hunt wild game, and he is Isaac's favorite. And Jacob stays closer to home. He is Rebekah's favorite. So this is actually not where we pick up the story in chapter 26, because most of chapter 26 is what we call anachronistic, and that just means that it takes place out of order. So in chapter 26, we don't hear about any children. But this chapter should seem a little bit like Groundhog Day, the same story repeated over and over again. So there is a famine in the land, and Isaac heads to Egypt. That should sound familiar already. Remember when Abraham, when he responded to God's call, there's a famine in the land and he heads off to Egypt. But this time, God stops Isaac. Okay? He made it as far as a place called Gerar, and that is Philistine territory, and the king there is Abimelech. And God tells him, listen, I want you to stay in the land. If you stay in the land, I will. And then he renews his covenant promises to him, that he will be blessed, that his descendants will be many, and one of his descendants will be the one through whom the whole world is blessed. And we know that that is Jesus. And Isaac is obedient. He obeys and he stays in the land. But he's in Philistine area. He's out on the border of the land, and he knows what it's like here. And so he says to Rebekah, listen, you're very beautiful, so we're going to tell them that you're my sister. Okay? Are you having deja vu yet? This actually happened with his father Abraham a couple of times. And the second time, it was with King Abimelech. Now you need to know that Abimelech is actually a dynastic name, so it doesn't mean it was the same guy. It's just the name of the king in that area. And so he pulls this off for a little while, and he's in the land for some time when Abimelech looks out his window, and he happens to notice Isaac and Rebekah, now it depends on what version you read, frolicking, sporting, jesting. Really, it comes from the word for laughing. And if you remember, Isaac got his name, it means to laugh, because his mother, Sarah, laughed twice when she was told that she would have a child in such old age. So Isaac gets caught Isaacing. Now, whatever this is, this frolicking, it is something that a brother and a sister would not typically do. So Abimelech knows that they are husband and wife, and he goes to him and same thing. What are you doing? Why would you tell me it's your sister? I mean, you almost brought guilt upon us. What if one of the men had been with your wife? So Abimelech gives orders that no one is to touch Isaac and Rebekah, or they will be put to death. Now, Isaac ends up flourishing in the land. He plants crops and it yields 100-fold, and he has more servants and he has herds and flocks, and he does so well that the Philistines become jealous. And Abimelech comes to him and he says, listen, you're way too powerful. We need you to go, and you need to go now. So Isaac does. He takes his stuff, he takes his people, and he leaves. And he heads out not too far into the valley. And he decides that he's going to redig all of the wells that his father Abraham had dug. The Philistines had filled them in after Abraham had died. So he digs a well, and the herdsmen come and they say, that's ours. Like, okay, whatever. So they move along, they dig up another well a little further out, and they're like, no, that's our well too. So he leaves there and he goes to a third place. He's moving a little further away, and they dig a well, and everybody leaves them alone, and everything is really good. And from there they move on to a place called Beersheba, which should sound familiar as well. Abraham spent time in Beersheba calling on the name of the Lord. And the Lord comes to Isaac and he tells him, listen, don't be afraid. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to bless you. And things seem really good. And then Abimelech shows up again. He comes from Gerar. And Isaac says, what's the deal? You know, you already kicked me out of the land. What do you want now? And Abimelech says, listen, I know that God's hand is on you. Don't you remember how well we treated you? We didn't harm you when you left the land, and we want you to do the same thing to us. So they enter into this treaty not to harm each other, and everything seems really good. Now there are a few lessons that we can pull out of this story. First of all, you should be able to tell that Isaac is not perfect. He is a little Abraham. He keeps falling into the same mistakes that he does over and over and again. And we see him on the spiritual high with God appearing to him and telling him to stay in the land. And then right after that, he goes and he lies to Abimelech and he pretends to be someone that he's not. The other lesson, and we've touched on this before, is that blessing doesn't come without hardship, without trouble. Isaac had to deal with famine. He had conflict with Abimelech. He had trouble with the Philistines. He had trouble with the herdsmen. You know, Paul says to the Corinthians, he says, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall, because we just never know what's going to happen. Former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis once said to his frustrated, impatient daughter, I can picture her just whining and complaining, he says, "My dear, if you would only recognize that life is hard, things would be so much easier for you." Isn't that the truth? That should just be the theme of our lives. Life comes with hardship. But God uses the hassles that Isaac experienced to bring him further and further back in the land, further, closer to him. I mean, if he hadn't had troubles, Isaac would have probably stayed right there in Gerar, but God moves him back. God allows trouble in our lives because it brings us to the places that we would never end up on our own, closer to God where he can bless us. Now, the end of this chapter does pick up right where we left off with the brothers. Esau is 40, and he ends up marrying 2 Hittite women, 2 foreigners, and this was really a no-no. And nobody's happy. And this leads us into chapter 27, and the theme here is the messed up family. This family is dysfunctional. Isaac's family, they're full of lies. They all want to do things their own way. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "A little lie is like a little pregnancy," and that very aptly summarizes the events in chapter 27. Now, here's what happens. Isaac wants to give Esau the patriarchal blessing. Okay, this is the blessing, the hopes and dreams passed on to his son. And it's not the same thing as the covenant blessing, but we don't know what his motive here. Was he trying to get something around on God, get something a little extra for Esau? But we also know that Isaac is very hungry. One of the reasons that he loves Esau so much is because Isaac loves game and Esau is a hunter. So he says he's really hungry. Go out, get some game, cook it up, and I'm going to give you the blessing. And the weird thing is he does it in secret. There's something not right here. Usually this would be done with the family all gathered around, but he does it in secret. Now Rebecca, she's eavesdropping on the entire situation, his wife, and this isn't going to fly. She comes up with a new plan, and she gets Jacob, and she says, "Listen, this is what your father wants to do. He's trying to go around us, but we're going to come up with our own plan." Now, Jacob doesn't really have a problem with it other than the fact that he's worried about getting caught and being cursed. And Rebecca tells him, "Don't worry about that. I'll take the curse on myself. I've got this figured out." So he goes and he gets 2 goats, and they cook it up like it's a wild game meal, and they bring it to Isaac. And Jacob says, "Here I am, Father." He says, "Well, who is it?" He said, "Well, it's Esau. It's your oldest son. I brought you your meal." And Isaac said, "Well, how did you get it so quickly?" And Jacob says, "Oh, the Lord blessed me, you know." In other words, as soon as I got out there, a deer stood right in front of me and just waited for me to shoot him, and I cooked it up and I brought it in. And Isaac tells him, to come closer, and he comes closer, and he feels his hands because Esau is very hairy, and Jacob is smooth-skinned, but they took some of the goat skin and they put it on his hands and neck. And he says, "Well, you sound like Jacob, but you feel like Esau." So that's enough for him. He eats his meal. He tells him to come over again to give him a kiss, and he smells him. And he smells like Esau because they had put on Esau's best clothes. And that's it. After that, he gives him the blessing. And it is, may you be blessed, may you have much, may you be wealthy, may you prosper. The nations will bow down to you. Even your brothers will bow down to you. And then Jacob hightails it out of there. As soon as he does, Esau comes back. Esau says, "Here I am, Father." And his dad's like, "Well, then who was just here?" They figure out what happened, that they had gotten duped, and Esau is just devastated. He's like, "Well, you have to give me a blessing." And his dad's like, "I already gave your blessing away. They can't go back on their word." And Esau's like, "Well, you got to have something little for me." And so his dad, Isaac, gives him this little blessing that's more of an anti-blessing than anything else. Yeah, you're not going to prosper. You're not going to do as well as your brother. In fact, you're going to live by the sword, and it's very anticlimactic. And Esau leaves. But he vows that as soon as his dad dies, he's going to kill his brother Jacob. Rebecca finds out, and she goes to Jacob. She said, "Listen, we got to get you out of here. You got to go to my brother Laban's because your brother wants to kill you. When things settle down, you can come back." Now, she doesn't go to her husband Isaac and say, "Listen, we all royally messed up here. I mean, this was embarrassing. We should have never done this. Now one of our sons wants to kill the other." Instead, she goes to him and says, "I am so tired of Esau and his foreign wives. I don't want the same thing to happen to Jacob. So we just need to send him to my brothers." And Isaac agrees. He didn't really care about who Esau married, but he sends him off. Wow. I mean, what a family. Isaac, who gets caught Isaacing when pretending to be something he's not, and then he tries to circumvent God's plan in secret. Rebekah eavesdrops on him, and she has this new plan of deception. Esau, who couldn't care less about his birthright, now wants everything and he's ready to kill his brother. And Jacob, mind you, he's not a little boy. He is probably 60 years old, at least at this point. He goes along with it, little mama's boy, and the only thing he's worried about is getting caught. Jacob gets caught Jacobing, seizing the heel, being a supplanter of his brother's rights, of his brother's title. Now, I don't want you to think that they all got away with this. Not whatsoever, okay? Not at all. God does sometimes allow what appears to be success in sin because he has a greater lesson to teach someone at a later point, at a later time. God's timing is strategic. At just the right time, God will either bring sin to our attention or he allows us to bear the unfruitful harvest. He allows us to reap the consequences of our actions. All these characters wanted to do things their own way. But listen, Isaac got duped after he tried to pull a fast one on Abimelech. He got duped in his own family. Rebekah, she never did see Jacob again. He was gone 20 years, and she died before he returned. Esau, he lost everything. And Jacob, well, just stay tuned because he gets duped in chapter 29. So listen, have you ever thought that you were too messed up or your family was too messed up for God to be able to use? Well, clearly, after looking at this family, that is not the case. I've said it before and I'll say it again. God uses broken people. It's all he has to work with, and he is happy to do it. Now, God wasn't mentioned in this chapter at all, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't still moving. He was moving in spite of and in the midst of brokenness. Jacob does end up getting the blessing, and God uses him. He uses him mightily, and yet Jacob still continues to mess up. Now, as the twists and turns make success very unlikely in all these stories that we've told, God's hand becomes more evident. There's no way these people could have accomplished anything on their own. God had to be in control. Now, this family remains dysfunctional. The nation splits, and they end up being taken into exile, and God is still moving among all of it. Nothing is going to stop his plan. Even when Jesus comes, things are still messed up. The religious leaders are looking out for themselves and not the sheep. The disciples are a mess. I mean, this was a motley crew, and yet it's through them that Jesus builds his church. See, he works despite and through their brokenness. Look at Judas. Judas, one of his own, betrays him. The religious leaders send him to the cross. And yet God is still moving in the midst of all of this. His plans are still being fulfilled. He was working in the midst of those people's plans to fulfill his own. I mean, look at this world. This world is an absolute mess. But do not think for 1 second that God has stopped moving. Don't believe that the world has never been this messed up. If you look back in church history, in history in general, the world has been pretty messed up. It just looks different today. I promise you, God is still moving. You need to remember this. God has never, ever taken one step back. See, the war's already been won, but there's more work to do. You see, we can't have the attitude, I've got mine. I know where I'm going, I got Jesus. No, we are here on this work being instruments, being tools of the Lord to bring more people to him so more people can say, I've got mine, I know where I'm going. We have work to do. Even though we're broken, God still works through us. But that's not an excuse to sin, to accept our sinfulness. See, we will sin, but we can't be indifferent to it just because we know that God can still use it. See, we sin because we're broken, but we don't choose to sin because we are new creatures, because we've been born again. Don't be afraid of letting God use you because you're messed up. See, not allowing God to use you is a really big mistake, and it is a missed blessing. Nothing can thwart the purpose of God. So why not work with him instead of against him? Amen.
Sun